Story 1: The Persistent Follower. Late-night walks have a peculiar kind of solitude, comforting yet unsettling. The streets are quiet. The world seemingly asleep. And every sound feels amplified against the stillness. For one man. What started as a peaceful stroll home turned into a waking nightmare when he realized he wasn't alone. It was a little past 10 p.m. when I left the cafe where I'd been working late. My apartment was only a 15-minute walk away. And the streets of my neighborhood were typically safe. The air was cool, crisp, and the orange glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk.
I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and began the familiar trek home, listening to the rhythmic crunch of my boots against the pavement. At first, everything seemed normal. Quiet houses, empty streets, a dog barking faintly in the distance.
And then I noticed him. At first, it was just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a figure about 20 feet behind me. I glanced back casually, not wanting to seem paranoid. A man. Average height. Average build. Wearing a dark jacket. Nothing unusual. I told myself it was nothing. Just someone else heading home. Walking the same route. Coincidence. But as I continued, something gnawed at the back of my mind. His footsteps mirrored mine. When I slowed, he slowed. When I quickened my pace, so did he. The first jolt of fear struck me when I turned onto a quieter street, hoping to lose him. The sound of his boots on the pavement followed me like an echo. I risked another glance over my shoulder. He was still there. My heart began to race. I turned again. This time onto a side street I didn't usually take, winding between rows of darkened houses. I glanced back again. He was still there. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath quickening. Rational thoughts battled with the growing panic in my mind. Maybe he lives here. Maybe he's just going the same way. But every fiber of my being screamed otherwise. I decided to test him. Reaching an intersection, I crossed the street abruptly, taking an exaggerated diagonal path. I didn't even make it halfway across before I heard it, the sharp sound of his boots following my lead. He crossed the street, too, keeping the same distance behind me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. By now, I was no longer walking, I was pacing. My movements jerky and frantic. I turned down another unfamiliar street, its emptiness making me feel more exposed than ever. A street lamp buzzed and flickered above me, casting an eerie glow. I dared another glance over my shoulder. He was closer now. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the shadowed outline of his figure. But his posture, there was something deliberate about it. Something predatory. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I fumbled to unlock it. The screen glowed brightly in the darkness, illuminating my face. I opened the dialer, but my mind went blank. Who could I call? What could I even say?
The sound of his footsteps grew louder. I panicked, shoving my phone back into my pocket and breaking into a brisk jog.
Ahead of me was a 24-hour convenience store, its neon sign flickering against the night sky. The thought of being around other people, even just a cashier, felt like a lifeline. I pushed through the glass doors, the sharp jingle of the bell signaling my entrance. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh and unwelcoming. But I didn't care. I went straight to one of the aisles, pretending to browse, my eyes darting toward the door. And then I saw him. He was standing just outside the store, his face partially obscured by shadows. For the first time, I got a clear look at him, or at least his eyes. They were fixed on me, unblinking. His head tilted slightly, as if he were studying me, trying to decide what to do next. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the shelf in front of me. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure the cashier could hear it. He didn't move. The glass door reflected his silhouette perfectly, a dark shape against the pale glow of the streetlights outside. He wasn't pacing or fidgeting. He was just standing there, watching. I couldn't stay here forever. I needed to act. I grabbed a random drink from the shelf and approached the counter, my legs shaky beneath me. The cashier barely looked up from his phone as he rang me up. I kept glancing over my shoulder, watching the man through the glass. My mind raced with possibilities. What would happen if I walked out? Would he follow me again? Would he do more than just follow this time? The cashier handed me my change, and I realized I had no plan. None. I had to leave. I had to face him. Clutching the bottle tightly in one hand, I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The air was colder now, biting at my skin.
He was gone.
I spun around, searching the street. But there was no sign of him. No footsteps echoing on the pavement. No shadow lingering under the street lamps. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I didn't waste another second. I bolted, sprinting the last few blocks to my apartment. The streetlights blurred around me as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally reached my building, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with every bolt and chain I had.
I stood there in the dark, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. My legs were trembling, my body drenched in cold sweat.
For hours, I sat by the window, staring out at the street below, half expecting to see him standing there again, waiting. But the street remained empty. I never saw him again. But the fear lingered. Even now, I can't walk home alone at night without looking over my shoulder. I can't hear footsteps behind me without feeling that familiar dread creeping in. Was he just some random man? A harmless stranger who happened to be walking the same route? Or was he something else, something darker? I'll never know. Story 2, the CVS encounter. It had been a rough week. My 3 kids were down with the flu, one after the other, turning my usually chaotic household into a battlefield of tissues, thermometers, and sleepless nights. By the time the last prescription was ready for pickup, I was running on fumes. It was late, almost 10 p.m., when I pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of the CVS near my house. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional car passing by. The fluorescent lights of the store flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows across the pavement. I parked on the side of the building, closer to the street, figuring it would be a quicker walk to the entrance. The air was biting, and I tugged my coat tighter around me as I stepped out of the car. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my husband, checking in. "Yeah, I'm here," I said, my voice low as I glanced toward the store entrance. "Just grabbing the meds and some Pedialyte for the kids. Be home soon." As I rounded the corner of the building, a man stepped out from behind a pillar near the entrance. "Hey, I've got a question for you," he said, his tone pleasant, almost conversational. At first glance, He didn't seem particularly threatening. He was average looking, bundled up in a dark jacket and scarf, his breath visible in the cold night air. He took a step closer, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Do you know where Main Street is?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. I hesitated, clutching my phone a little tighter. Something about the way he positioned himself, blocking the path to the door, made my stomach twist. "Still," I answered politely. "Yeah. It's about 2 blocks down," I said, motioning vaguely in the direction. "Could you give me a ride there?" he asked, his tone shifting ever so slightly. "It's freezing out here, and I don't want to freeze to death." I smiled apologetically, shaking my head. "I'm sorry. I can't. My kids are sick at home, and I'm just here to pick up their medicine." His expression darkened for a fraction of a second before it smoothed over, replaced by a forced smile. "Well, what am I supposed to do? It's just down the street. I'm not asking for much." There was something in his eyes now, a simmering frustration that made my skin crawl. I glanced back toward my car, suddenly wishing I hadn't parked so far from the store's entrance. "I can't help with that," I said firmly, starting to edge toward the door. "But I'm sure the store employees could call someone for you." The moment the words left my mouth, his entire demeanor changed.
Do you even know what happens to people like me when they're left out here? He snapped, his voice rising. "You're going to let me freeze to death, aren't you?"
I took a step back, my heart racing as I tried to keep my tone calm. "I'm sorry. I really can't. I don't care," he shouted, cutting me off. "You're going to help me. You have to help me." He took a step closer, and I instinctively moved sideways, angling myself toward the door. My mind was racing. Should I run? Should I shout for help? My phone was still in my hand, the call with my husband still active. "Are you okay?" My husband's voice crackled faintly through the phone. "No," I whispered, barely audible, hoping the man wouldn't notice. I tried to stay calm, pulling my face mask out of my pocket and holding it up as a barrier between us. "Look, I'm not feeling well, and my husband is on the phone," I said, trying to sound firm. "I'm just going to grab what I need and leave." He sneered, his lip curling as he muttered something under his breath. But he didn't move to block me this time. I took the opportunity to slip past him, practically sprinting through the sliding doors into the store. Inside, the store felt unnaturally bright, the sterile lighting doing little to ease my nerves. My hands were shaking as I approached the pharmacy counter. "There's a man outside," I said quickly, glancing over my shoulder. "He's acting strange." The pharmacist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, nodded, her expression hardening. "Stay here," she said, turning to call the store manager. I stayed behind the counter, clutching my phone tightly as I heard the faint sound of raised voices near the entrance. And then, suddenly, he was back. The glass doors slid open, and the man stormed inside, his face twisted in rage. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, pointing a finger in my direction. "You think you can just ignore me?"
My heart felt like it was about to explode. I pressed myself against the counter, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us.
The store manager, a tall, burly man with a long beard, stepped between us. "Sir," "You need to leave," he said firmly. "You're trespassing." The man didn't back down. He continued shouting, spewing obscenities and accusations that echoed through the store. The pharmacist grabbed my arm and guided me behind a partition, out of his line of sight. "I'm calling the police," she whispered. Minutes felt like hours as we waited, the man's voice growing louder and more unhinged. The manager stood his ground, keeping himself between the man and the rest of us. Finally, the wail of sirens cut through the chaos. The man froze for a moment, his eyes darting toward the doors. When the police officers entered, he tried to bolt, but they caught him before he could get far. The officers spoke to me briefly, taking my statement and assuring me that the man had a long history of similar incidents. "He likes to scare people," one of them said, shaking his head. "But he's not usually violent." That wasn't much comfort. I finished my purchase and walked back to my car with an officer accompanying me. Even with the parking lot now quiet and empty, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I lay awake, replaying the encounter in my mind. What if I hadn't been able to slip past him? What if the store hadn't been open? The next time I had to run a late-night errand, I parked directly in front of the entrance, my keys clutched tightly in my hand as I walked. My husband insisted on coming with me. Even now, I double-check my surroundings whenever I leave the house. I know the chances of running into someone like him again are slim. But once that fear takes hold, it's hard to let go. Story 3: The Dangerous Walk Home. It was supposed to be a simple walk home, no different from the dozens my mother and sister had taken before. The path was familiar, running parallel to a quiet main road that stretched through our sleepy neighborhood. It was just past sunset, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples. But the air carried an eerie stillness that seemed to amplify every step they took. My mother, a fiercely independent woman, rarely showed fear. At 45, she had faced her share of hardships, raising 2 daughters on her own while battling illness. But even her resilience had its limits. On that night, with shadows closing in and danger lurking in plain sight, she learned how thin the line between ordinary and life-altering could be. The trouble started just as they left the small public call office. My mom had been using the phone to speak with my uncle, desperate for advice about her crumbling marriage. The call ran longer than expected, and by the time they hung up, the market was nearly deserted. The streets were empty except for a few flickering streetlights and the occasional car speeding by. As my mother and sister started their 2-mile walk home, the sound of footsteps behind them caught my mom's attention. She glanced back casually, her heart sinking at what she saw. 2 men. They weren't walking together. Exactly. One was on foot, trailing closely behind, while the other rode a bicycle, circling lazily in wide arcs along the street. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Maybe they were heading home too. Maybe they were just coincidentally moving in the same direction. But as the minutes ticked by, their intentions became harder to ignore. The man on foot quickened his pace, closing the distance between them. The man on the bike slowed, his circles growing tighter, as if corralling them. A cold dread settled in my mother's chest. She reached out, gripping my sister's hand tightly. My sister, only 17 at the time, sensed the tension but didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The unspoken understanding passed between them like an electric current: something is wrong. As they neared the first intersection, the man on the bicycle veered ahead, cutting them off. My mother slowed her pace, her mind racing. She stole another glance behind her. The man on foot was closer now, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. He wasn't smiling. "Let's keep walking," my mom whispered to my sister. Her voice steadied despite the panic rising in her throat. But then, a new threat emerged. From the corner of her eye, my mom saw the headlights first, a white van, moving slowly along the service road parallel to them. The van's engine hummed softly, almost too quietly for its size. As it crawled forward, matching their pace, the van crept closer. Its windows tinted so dark my mom couldn't see who, or how many, were inside. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tightened her grip on my sister's hand. "Stay close to me," she said firmly, her eyes darting between the van and the two men. The man on the bike swerved back toward them, his path narrowing until he was only a few feet away. He smiled, a thin, crooked grin that sent a chill down my mom's spine.
"Need a ride?" he called out, his voice light but laced with menace.
"No thank you," my mom replied sharply, not breaking her stride. The man on foot let out a low chuckle, and my mom's stomach twisted. The van pulled up alongside them now, its engine idling. The passenger window rolled down just enough for a face to peer out, a man in his mid-30s, with a scruffy beard and dark eyes that glinted in the dim streetlight. "You ladies lost?" he asked, his tone feigning concern. "We're fine," my mom snapped, her voice colder now. But they didn't move on. The van lingered, keeping pace with them as the man on foot moved even closer. The service road narrowed ahead, leading to a darker, more isolated stretch. My mom's heart raced as she realized they were being herded, the men closing in like wolves circling their prey. Then, as if fate intervened, two figures appeared in the distance. At first, they were just shadows on the horizon, two men walking toward them from the opposite direction. As they got closer, my mom recognized one of them, the local pharmacist. A kind man who had always been polite during her trips to pick up medication. His companion was a friend, a burly man who exuded quiet strength. The pharmacist waved as they approached. "Good evening," he called out cheerfully, oblivious to the tension hanging thick in the air. The change in the atmosphere was immediate. The man on foot stopped abruptly, his body stiffening. The cyclist faltered, his bike wobbling slightly before he turned sharply, pedaling away without a word. The van's engine roared as the driver hit the gas, speeding off down the service road and disappearing into the night. The pharmacist frowned, glancing at my mom and sister. "Are you all right?" Relief washed over my mom so quickly she felt dizzy. "We are now," she said, her voice shaking. The pharmacist and his friend didn't ask many questions. They simply fell into step beside my mom and sister, escorting them the rest of the way home. When they finally reached our apartment complex, my mom turned to the two men, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." The pharmacist smiled warmly. "You're safe now. That's what matters." But even as they walked away, my mom couldn't shake the lingering fear. The what-ifs haunted her. What if they hadn't appeared? What if the van had blocked their path completely? For weeks after that night, my mom avoided the service road altogether, taking longer, well-lit routes instead. She never saw the men or the van again. But their presence lingered in her mind. A constant reminder of how quickly normalcy could give way to danger.
I wish I could say that was the end of it. That I locked my door that night, took a deep breath, and moved on. But fear doesn't work like that. It lingers. It festers.
4 weeks. I swore I caught glimpses of him, on my street. In the corner of my vision while walking home. Even in reflections of store windows. But every time I turned, he was gone. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was something else. Then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it. A single, deliberate knock on my apartment door. Slow. Rhythmic. I held my breath. My heart hammering against my ribs. Knock. 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 I crept toward the peephole. Dread curling in my stomach. My fingers shook as I covered the lens. Barely peering through the small space. The hallway was empty.
But when I checked the security camera feed on my phone the next morning, there was a single frame that chilled me to my core.
A shadowy figure standing just outside my door. Looking up at the camera. Smiling. Who, or what, was he? And more importantly, why me? Let me know what you think in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where someone followed you a little too closely? A time when you felt watched? Let's talk about it. And if you love terrifying true stories like this one, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for you.